this landmass. 3,000 miles of jagged mountains, endless deserts, impenetrable forests, and extreme weather. For most of human history, the idea of uniting this vast, hostile wilderness under a single flag wasn't just ambitious, it was geographically impossible. This is a continent that actively fights against human expansion. It is cut in half by massive river systems, walled off by mountain ranges, and prone to tornadoes, hurricanes, and blizzards. Yet in the span of just a few centuries, a small collection of starving, desperate colonies clinging to the edge of the Atlantic managed to conquer this impossible geography. They didn't just survive it. They chained it with steel, crossed it with asphalt, and transformed it into the most powerful nation in human history. But conquering a continent comes at a terrible price. This is the story of how America was forged, not just through politics and ideals, but through a brutal, unrelenting war against the land itself. Before European ships ever touched these shores, this continent was already home to millions. For over 10,000 years, indigenous nations, from the Iroquois in the northeast to the Navajo in the southwest, adapted to the extremes of this land. They understood what the Europeans were about to learn the hard way. Nature here does not compromise. When the first British settlers arrived in places like Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620, the continent almost killed them. They faced brutal winters, unfamiliar diseases, and starvation. But as they established the 13 colonies, they found themselves trapped. To their east was the ocean. To their west, the Appalachian Mountains stood like a massive, impenetrable wall, locking them onto a narrow strip of coastline. For 150 years, they were hemmed in. They were British subjects, separated by vast distances, dense forests, and completely different economies. A merchant in Boston had almost nothing in common with a plantation owner in Virginia. The idea that these divided, isolated settlements could ever unite was laughable to the British crown. By the 1770s, the British Empire needed money to pay off its war debts, and they looked to the American colonies to foot the bill. Heavy taxes without representation ignited a powder keg. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, it was logistical suicide. They were picking a fight with the greatest military superpower on Earth. The British had a global navy. The Americans had farmers with hunting rifles. But America had a secret weapon: the continent itself. The British were fighting an ocean away from their supply lines, trying to control a landmass too vast to hold. George Washington didn't need to destroy the British army. He just needed to survive the brutal winters and keep his army intact long enough for the British to exhaust themselves. With the help of the French, the impossible happened. At Yorktown in 1781, the British surrendered. The colonies were free. But now, they had to figure out how to be a country. Freedom brought a new problem. How do you govern a sprawling, disconnected land? The founders wrote the Constitution in 1787 to bind the states together. But the true test of the nation wouldn't be laws, it would be land. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made the deal of the century. For $15 million, he bought the Louisiana Territory from France, instantly doubling the size of the United States. Suddenly, the impossible continent was open. This sparked an ideology that would define America: manifest destiny. The belief that the United States was destined by God to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of pioneers packed everything they owned into wooden wagons and walked across the continent. They faced the lethal Rocky Mountains, cholera, starvation, and extreme heat. But this expansion was not a victimless victory. Conquering the continent meant clearing it. The United States government waged relentless campaigns against the indigenous populations, forcing them from their ancestral lands through broken treaties, war, and forced marches like the tragic Trail of Tears. The map was being painted red, white, and blue, but the ink was blood. By the mid-19th century, America had stretched to the Pacific Ocean. But the bigger the nation grew, the more it fractured. The geography itself had created two entirely different Americas. In the north, cold winters and rocky soil led to an economy based on factories, industry, and immigrant labor. In the south, the warm climate and fertile soil created a massive agricultural empire, an empire built entirely on the brutal, horrific system of African slavery. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the southern states broke away. The impossible continent was finally tearing itself apart. The American Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. Over 600,000 Americans died, more than in WW1 and WW2-4 combined. It took 4 years of mechanized slaughter to hold the nation together. In 1865, the Union was preserved, and slavery was finally abolished. The United States had survived its greatest test, but the scars would last for generations. After the Civil War, America stopped walking across the continent and started paving it. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. A journey that used to take 6 months of deadly travel now took 6 days. The impossible geography had been tamed by steel and steam. The United States entered the Industrial Revolution with unparalleled advantages: endless natural resources, vast agricultural lands, and millions of immigrants pouring in to build the future. By the dawn of the 20th century, America was no longer a fractured experiment. It was an economic titan. When the world went to war, America's geographic isolation became its greatest shield. With oceans on both sides, the U.S. mainland was untouched by the devastation of World War I and World War II. While Europe and Asia were bombed to rubble, American factories were untouched, churning out the weapons that would win the wars. When the dust settled in 1945, the United States emerged as a global superpower. The nation that started as a few starving colonists pinned against the ocean had conquered the land, the sky, and by 1969, they left the continent entirely to put a man on the moon. Today, it is easy to look at a map of the United States and see it as inevitable. But history tells a different story. The United States is a nation forged in defiance of its own geography. It is built on triumphs of engineering, radical ideals of liberty, and a dark, heavy history of conquest.
If you enjoyed this journey through American history, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments which era of the impossible continent we should cover in depth next.